The most important part of the early chapters of Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is his definition of virtue. And we're going to talk about that definition in this video. I will leave to the next video any discussion of particular virtues. We're going to have a whole list of those and a handout with the list of the ones that are going to be particularly important to us. You can find Aristotle's definition of virtue on page 29 of your text. It reads, virtue then is a state that decides, consisting in a mean, the mean relative to us, which is defined by reference to reason, that is to say, to the reason by reference to which the prudent person would define it. It is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Now, that whole thing is Aristotle's definition of virtue. You notice that he carves it up one piece after another into the particular kind of state that it is. Now, the word that is translated here as state can also be translated as habit. And that is the translation I'm going to use for it. And I think you'll see in what follows why I use the term habit. Those of you who are regular LMU students will recognize a typical University Hall classroom. I gave you this board because it encapsulates everything there is to say, I think, about Aristotle's definition of virtue. Now, if you look closely at the definition, it actually has 10 parts. And there's something to be said about each one of these parts. And all of this is from the surrounding chapters of Book 2 before and after the definition actually occurs on page 29. So when Aristotle says virtue is a habit, so piece number one is that virtue is a habit. That means that Aristotle's unit of evaluation, as I've called it, is also not an individual action. So for Mill, the unit of moral evaluation, of ethical evaluation, is the individual action. For Kant, it is the maxim. For Aristotle, it is a habit, right? That is the unit of moral evaluation. And how do we get a habit? We get a habit through many repetitions of doing the right thing so that doing the right thing becomes second nature to us. It becomes an aspect of our character. And I said at one point that for Kant, our whole system of maxims would be what Kant would think of as our character. For Aristotle, our collection, so to speak, of virtues and some coherent collection of virtues, a harmonious, coherent collection, would be what Aristotle means by virtues. So then he says it's a habit of deliberate choice. Now, deliberate and choice do turn out to be two different things for him. What deliberation is for Aristotle is a matter of recognizing the different options that are available to us. So that should resonate with the paper assignment for the course. We recognize the different options that are available to us, and we sort through those options in order to choose the best. That's what deliberation is for Aristotle. That's the deliberate part of deliberate choice. The choice part of deliberate choice refers to something we're going to talk about in a subsequent video, and that is Aristotle's distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions. He's actually going to have a third category, those that are voluntary in a qualified way, and that will turn out to be, for various reasons, the most interesting category. But Aristotle does think that some of the actions we take, at least some of the things we do with our bodies, are involuntary. Those would not be choices. They would be something that essentially happens to us. But virtue only applies to those things that we choose in an active way. Number 5 is very, very important, and you might compare number 5 to the whenever clause of Kant's maxim, right? Because what relative to us means, that a virtue is always a habit that is relative to us, is there are many different aspects of someone's circumstances. There are circumstances in life, there are circumstances at a particular time that can have an effect on how we judge whether an action they take is moral or not. So what counts as a courageous action for one person might be a cowardly action for another, and we'll have a number of examples of this as we go through Aristotle, but I gave a list of an incomplete list of ways that virtue can be relative to us. One is age. The virtue of a young person is not the same as the virtue of an older person. Training is another one, right? So for a trained firefighter not to run into a burning building is probably not virtuous. On the other hand, for someone with no training, that may be the most courageous thing that he or she can do. Our physical condition can affect what would be a virtuous action for us to undertake. Someone who is physically stronger, what would count as a good action for them might be an action that another person ought not take. Emotional state, right? So if you're distraught for some other reason, if you're experiencing acute grief, if you're very angry, what it might be virtuous for you to do in that situation might be to hold back from an action that another person ought to take in that situation. Someone's state of health, even state of health on a particular day, can affect what the virtuous action would be for them under those circumstances. Likewise, someone's position in society could affect what a virtue is relative to them. Number 6, virtue is defined by reason. And here we ask my favorite philosophical question, as opposed to what? And on number 6, on the right side of the board, I've indicated several contrasting terms. The fact that virtue is defined by reason means it's not defined by our feelings, but it's also not defined by tradition or religion or a long list of other things that are not, strictly speaking, rational. But a particular kind of reason is more relevant to ethical decision-making than any other kind of reasoning. And that is the type of reason that Aristotle calls practical wisdom, or sometimes it's translated as prudence, as I think it is in this text. Now, what is practical wisdom? Ordinarily, we don't talk a whole lot about wisdom unless we're talking about old people. And we do have this image of a wise person needing to be old. But we really need to qualify that a little bit for a couple of reasons. One is we all know, hopefully, a wise older person. But we all also probably know an older person who is just angry and bitter, and not the kind of older person whom you would go to for advice. Age is not the only factor that will determine whether someone is wise or not. We'll have to think about what that is. But also, you can have someone who's relatively young, who is wise by virtue of their life experience. So when I was first learning Germany in Berlin 30 years ago, in my very first German class, there was a young man, I think he was about 8 or 9 years old, who was a refugee from the Bosnian War. So he had, as a child, for several years, been in a wartime situation. And even though he was 8 or 9 and I was in my late 20s, He had had by that point much more life experience than I had, and in certain ways he was probably wiser. So we can see on the basis of his example that it isn't age so much as it is experience that's the determining factor in whether someone will have prudence or practical wisdom or not. But you can have an older person who's had a ton of experience who doesn't turn out to be wise. So we have to add something to experience to determine what practical wisdom is. What we need to add is the willingness and the ability to learn from experience. Okay, so it has to be someone who's had a great deal of experience and someone who has also processed that experience and been willing and able to learn something from it. I once had a student who mentioned to me that her grandmother had lived to 102 years old. And I said, that's fantastic. You must have asked her what her secret is. And she said, oh, I know what her secret is. And that is that she lived very slowly and she shielded herself from every dangerous experience whatsoever. And she said, that's not a person whose life I want to imitate. She actually turned out to be that 102-year-old woman, at least according to my student, was someone who was not a candidate for wisdom because she really hadn't lived that much. She had lived a very sheltered life and kept herself as sheltered as she possibly could. So 7, a practically wise person. It's not all kinds of reason, but this specific kind of reason, practical wisdom, that's relevant for ethical living, as opposed to what? Well, the kind of reasoning that you might get just from math, for instance. Kind of logical reasoning is not what you need. What you need is this life wisdom that comes from experience and the willingness and ability to learn from experience. Number 8, if I can read my handwriting, it is a mean, right? Virtue is a mean. Well, it's going to be a mean between extremes. And it's very important to say that it is not a mean in a mathematical sense, right? It's not a mathematical mean that we're talking about. We're talking about a mean that is between two extremes. But remember number 5 of the definition, relative to us. What turns out to be the mean between extremes in a given situation for a given person is not going to be at the exact mathematical midpoint between two extremes. Practical wisdom is going to have to decide, for me at this stage of life, in this particular situation, what is the mean between extremes for me? And 9 and 10, those extremes are called vices, right? So the mean is the virtue, the two extremes are the vices. One vice is excess, too much of something. Most of Aristotle's virtues have to do with an emotion, like fear or anger, or compassion, for instance. Feeling compassion, for instance, for someone who's poor, that might motivate you to generosity. The vice of excess always means too much of whatever it is that the virtue is about. So if it's about anger, the vice of excess is an excess of anger. And likewise, there's a vice of deficiency, which is not enough of whatever that virtue is about. So in the case of courage, you can talk about courage in terms of fear, courage in terms of confidence. So if we talk about virtue in terms of confidence, the vice of deficiency of virtue, which is cowardliness, is not enough confidence in the face of danger. Now, don't worry, we're going to talk in much more detail about courage, which is also sometimes translated as bravery in another video. I think it's the video after the next one. So this is just to get the structure of what virtue is for Aristotle. Then for each individual virtue that we want to talk about, we'll want to ask ourselves, how do each of the 10 aspects of this definition apply to that particular virtue? Some of the parts will be more relevant than others to particular virtues. The one part that's going to be relevant to every single virtue is number 7. We're always going to ask, what counts as prudence? What counts as practical wisdom for courage, for generosity, for any of the other virtues? And how is prudence or practical wisdom going to assist us in determining exactly where the mean is relative to us or relative to the person you're writing about in your paper? How is prudence or practical wisdom going to help us determine exactly where the mean is in this particular situation?